We have Paul Salem with us, president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I started my own international relations journey there some 16 years ago, helping edit the Middle East Journal. And I actually got my first job there as an editor, so thanks to MEI. We also have Maha Yahya, director of the Malcom Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center here in Beirut. Maha is the only guest on the podcast that I haven't met in person until today, until moments ago. So it's an honor to meet you.
Pleasure here.
And Maha introduced me to something quite special, the first ministerial statement from independent Lebanon's first cabinet addressing sectarianism and how to remove sectarianism some 80 years ago. So that is still in my mind. We've made so much progress in the last 80 years.
Unfortunately.
In New York, we have Amer Bisat, managing director and head of sovereign and emerging markets at Blackrock. Paul Salem, let's start with you. As someone who's seen this country go from civil war to post-civil war to Syrian hegemony, post-Syrian hegemony, and what feels like permanent paralysis today. I'll start by asking a broader question and perhaps a regional one. Where does Lebanon stand right now? Given the fallout from George Odeh's comments about a month ago, his recent resignation, and Hezbollah's dramatic influence over Lebanese affairs. And can we expect any serious re-engagement, at least with the GCC and more importantly, Saudi Arabia, as long as Hezbollah has that leverage, which seems to be unshakable?
Thank you, Ronnie, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody and my great colleagues on this panel. You asked both a big picture and a sort of a small picture question. In the big picture, Lebanon is really in one of the most dire conditions in its modern history. If you dissect the basic pillars at the level of the state lost its sovereignty in the late 1960s to the PLO and lost it for a while during the Civil War and lost it after the war to Hezbollah on one side, and while the Syrians were here, to the Syrians when they were here. It remains a state without sovereignty, hence without the basic building blocks of what a state should be, able to control its borders, control its territory, and have a monopoly of force. The state with a small s, which I would say is like the administration, the government, the management of affairs, did function over the last 30 years, imperfectly, but life went on, and there was some rebuilding and sort of revival after the war. But the state with a small s has collapsed in the last 2 years, certainly linked to the economic side of the collapse, which Amer knows more deeply and more detailed than I. But when you look at a nation state, its economy is also its lifeblood. So when the economy completely collapses, the lifeblood of the people of the country is lost. And we are losing, obviously, tens of thousands, if not more, of our people to emigration, and maybe more to come. And a nation state is a people, a land and a state. The more people we lose, the more dangerous it is. At the level of society, maybe we see competing trends. At one level, the society is deeply divided. There is a continuing sectarian division, which I think you were mentioning, Ronnie, is decades old. But we have a deeper division, I think, with Hezbollah's presence, which is presenting a completely different project for a nation than sort of the traditional or what was the modern Lebanese project for its people. That's a much more fundamental, people-to-people contradiction. On the positive side, I think since 2019, we've seen an awakening, a great, movement from a wide cross-section of people that is, overstretching or going beyond certainly sectarian divisions, emphasizing common national and civic identities and goals, and is also recognizing that the people have to be engaged in political life and must take responsibility for their political life and should not continue to leave politics, as I would argue we had for the previous 29 years, leave it to the politicians, leave it to the oligarchs. So I would say we are in a very, very precarious position, which is made worse by our regional environment in which we find ourselves. We are next door to a country, Syria, which completely imploded, 10 years ago, dominated by a predatory mafia, whatever you want to call it, very, very predatory state. Syria is, we're in worse shape than Lebanon, and I sadly don't see them recovering anytime soon. And they are our immediate next door neighbors. Obviously, we don't have relations with Israel, and that's a blocked road itself. You did ask about the wider geopolitical situation. Sadly, Iran is the main player in Lebanon, as we all know. But when we look at others, I would say in the West, in Europe, the United States, we've seen a lot of positive, I think, orientation to try to help Lebanon, try to help the economic reform, economic recovery, certainly helping the army, trying to keep the country stable. Traditionally, or in the past, the Gulf countries used to always be alongside Lebanon and helping. That is not currently the case, as you know. It predates certainly the Qardahi situation. It goes back to a great, I would say, partly disappointment from the Gulf by Lebanese politicians cooperating too much, I would say, with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah ending up controlling all the main positions of the Lebanese state, and them feeling that that's not something they want to invest in. But also, I would say countries like Saudi Arabia are turning inward, caring more about their economic future and less interested in sort of adventures here and there. I am hopeful that this position from the Gulf, I'm not hopeful, I hope is what I want to say. I hope that this position moderates or changes. The Gulf and Saudi Arabia and the UAE are heavily engaged in a positive way in Iraq. And certainly there's a lot of Iranian and militia influence there. So I would hope that they would reconsider their fairly extreme position on Lebanon and re-engage, because certainly they are greatly needed. That was a long answer, Ronnie. Sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, it's a thorough answer. Thanks for that. We'll get back to the GCC fallout as well. But I'd like the segue to economics, and you pointed at that, Paul. I'll rope in Amer to the question here, and I'll step back a bit, because the last time we spoke, Amer, I think we were both talking about the IMF deal, and this is maybe some almost 18 months ago, if not nearly 2 years ago, that in hindsight was looking more and more like it was heading nowhere. And there was some measured optimism back then. But clearly the measures needed to alleviate suffering were ignored. You wrote extensively on this issue. I remember your emergency plans that were published either in An-Nahar, if memory serves me right, in Carnegie as well. So I read your work, and it's obvious that those steps were missed. Let's fast forward to today, end of 2021, a cabinet that hasn't met in nearly 2 months, an IMF deal that has yet to see the light of day. Could you offer some perspective on the chances of a deal emerging between now and next year's planned parliamentary elections, and whether or not this is even feasible in such a limited time, or if it'll be punted over to the next government if and when one is formed? So sorry for that huge question, but just the IMF deal in perspective.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to maychidia and also to the rest of the panelists as well. Very happy to be here. Listen, you ask I want to answer the question in two different ways, if you don't mind. Mechanistically on the short term and the broader answer. Over the short term, one has to give credit where credit is due. The negotiations are ongoing. This is a cabinet that seems fairly serious about the technical preparations for the extremely complicated negotiations with the IMF. The technical discussions are ongoing. The data, the modeling, the framework is being discussed. The willingness and the desire to reach a deal is palpable. You could simply see it from the cabinet itself, from the officials, the technicians in the cabinet, the technocrats in the cabinet at least, including the prime minister himself, I would add. and also importantly from the IMF itself. The noise from the fund itself is incredible willingness and desire to help the authorities as much as they can. So at least at that very short-term mechanistic level, the news is good. They're talking to each other, they're putting the numbers together, and I would go one step further. I would say the negotiations themselves on the policy framework are ongoing as well, right? But starting negotiations is very different than finishing them. And while I am pleasantly surprised by the fact that they seem to be moving, I continue to be quite nervous and quite cautiously pessimistic about the chances of reaching a deal eventually, right? And the best way of looking at it is sort of entangling in terms of metaphors. I think Lebanon is facing a triple whammy at this point, right? The house is on fire, right? As in the place itself is completely imploding economically in a way that I don't need to describe it at this stage. It's extremely clear and obvious to everybody. And in and of itself, that's a program that needs to be negotiated. How do you stop the fire? The stabilization phase of an IMF deal. How do you how do you arrest the collapse? In and of itself, that's a huge challenge, right? But that's not enough, because that's not what Lebanon is facing, the only thing that Lebanon is facing. Lebanon is facing a house on fire when the foundations of the house themselves are collapsing, right? The institutional structure as a whole, the balance sheet, not to be too technical, but the balance sheet of the country is imploding, right? The banks, the public sector. The massive loss of productive capacity, all the foundations of, so even if we stop the fire and extinguish it, the house itself needs complete rebuilding structurally. And the IMF program will almost certainly want us to at least imagine the new foundations, right? Which brings me to the third element, which is going to be negotiated, which is going to make the negotiations even more complicated, is that the management of the crisis itself, the political context through which this crisis needs to be managed, is almost non-existent. The timing is extremely unpropitious and extremely unfavorable and unfortunate. We are 4 or 5 months away from elections, a year away from presidential elections. The regional framework that Paul spoke about very nicely is extremely unfavorable at this stage. So even the political willingness to do what is needed to do, to stop the fire, let alone rebuild the foundations, is simply not there. And you could see it even right now on something as basic as a capital controls law, which is so rudimentary and simple and basic. I mean, if we can't agree on that, we will, and maybe we'll have opportunity to talk about them later, the kinds of measures that are needed, the road ahead to get to a deal are extremely tenuous and problematic. So at least they're talking, give them credit for that, but they have 3 huge challenges. We need to stabilize, we need to restructure, and we need a political context that allows us to do these 2 things. At this point, I don't see either of these.
We'll get back to those measures, and thank you for outlining that. Let's sort of dance back to the international realm. I'm going to ask you, Maha Yahya. We've spoken at length, I think, about the role parliamentary elections can have in terms of local politics and local political agency. We saw the dramatic increase in voter registration, diaspora voter registration. If the numbers are right, I believe 2018 was something like 80,000, and it's reaching 240,000, if not more. So there's a dramatic increase. Now, whether these elections happen, March, May, whether they're postponed outright, how significant is that number in trying to steer political developments forward? And I guess within that question, that let's assume the majority of the newly registered voters support change. Let's assume they're predominantly October 17 inclined registered voters. Can change actually happen through parliament? And I'm sorry if that's such a simple way of looking at it, but I really mean it in terms of local agency, given the economic hindrances, and given what Paul alluded at, which is the international dynamics that shape local politics.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's wonderful to be on this panel with you and with friends and colleagues around the screen. Thank you, May, for inviting us. Just very briefly, look, change in a country like Lebanon can only happen through elections. And change takes a long time This idea that somehow with one set of elections we're going to turn the country upside down it doesn't happen anywhere. This only happens when there's a military coup. This is not a country where you can have a military coup. So the notion that change will happen through the elections are incredibly important, but they're not the only thing. What heartens me right now is that there are considerable efforts and there's a lot of work and a lot of initiatives that are going into. It wasn't just about the voter registration, it's also about a broader political culture that wants change. It's about getting into the habit of having public debates around policy choices, around a future vision for Lebanon. Groups running for the elections on the basis of programs, not on the basis of belonging or sectarian or family or other kinds of affiliations. So I think these are incredibly important in that sense. Now, whether the figures you cite will push for the kind of dramatic change we're hoping for, we don't know. Elections are very fickle in a sense, especially again in a country like Lebanon, where it's not like the US, it's not two political parties running off against each other. Here at the local level, you have a lot of different dynamics that come into play. Things change. We're in the Middle East, after all. The Middle East you sleep to is not necessarily the one you wake up to. So things change very rapidly. And the local dynamics do have an important factor. I mean, we've seen a lot of the discussions that are around elections at this point, and we're seeing the extent to which family affiliations and other kinds of dynamics are coming into play when people are thinking about who they may elect. However, what also again heartens me is I see that for the first time in maybe decades, we are seeing a real demand for change. And it's not just with the groups that have emerged, and Hussein can speak a lot more about this, but even in popular discussions, go into any living room today in Lebanon, and there is some discussion around that. And I think that's quite important also to kind of zoom in on. But just in short, elections are not the be-it-all. They're just one step in a long transition, and we have to have a kind of the patience for the long game.
I appreciate that perspective. And that's actually, you offered me such a generous segue to introduce Hussein Achi. I think I've seen so much happen through your eyes, from defiance and activism, and which is what you said, Maha, earlier, those demands for change, not happening in politics, but on the street on October 17, 2019. And now you've changed very quickly from a street protester to a political party secretary general in a very short period of time. I think this is also all the more important that this is one of the most difficult chapters in modern Lebanese history. So you're politicking during immense pain and suffering, and you're succeeding. So I'm going to ask you a big question to start with. Demands for change and the ability to unify those demands. What does unity look like to you? And I know this is a sensitive subject because I think we kind of hinted at it already. Every minute, every second on social media or news bulletins, we're talking about politics all the time. Yeah. And I think unity seems to be that one core issue, which is dividing protester demands. And if you'll let me, I'll be as specific as I can. I think you already know where I'm going. You have two syndicate elections, one in June, the Order of Architects and Engineers, which saw victory for opposition parties. Was it just 2 weekends ago? The Bar Association elections, you saw overwhelming defeat. So, in that perspective, is there a way to unify at this stage, to gain more parliamentary seats next year? Or is it a fait accompli that these two sides or this division is too deep to rectify?
First, I want to thank you and thank Maha and Paul and Amer when I found out that I was going to be on this talk hosted by the maychidiacfoundation. I was very pleased. I remember when you called me. So thank you for that. And I want to just begin by saying something very important, Ronnie. It's true that we came from the streets, and I did tell you before that at first we were very resistant to the idea of organizing politically. But these 2 years were, as you put it, extremely hard. And the collective trauma that we went through, especially after the Beirut blast, which in my opinion was even more important in our political development than the protest movement of 2019, that was a big catalyst, for us deciding that, we need to organize politically. And when, Maha, you were talking just now, recently, you were actually talking our narrative, because this is what we say. We became much more realistic after the blast and after the collective trauma. Yani, we weren't really saying that we want to take down the whole system and, build the foundation of a new system on top of it. We were much more attached to conserving what's left of these flawed institutions that we have for the future. While we say, and we always say, that we need change, we need actual change, we need to change the social contract eventually. But today, we need to work with what we have. Because at the end of the day, Ronnie, what scares us the most is what is at stake if we don't unify and if we don't create, some sort of victory in the next parliamentary elections. And when I say victory, I'm not talking about the majority, winning the majority in parliament. We need progress, We need to go and tell everyone that worked so hard during the past 2 years that, look, we are getting somewhere. Because killing that momentum can be lethal to the whole movement on the long run. And when we talk about unity, we are not saying that we are all the same and we are going under a single ticket, under a single... What we're saying is that given the circumstances and with looking at the foe that is in front of us, we need to have at least a common platform, a common program, and common lists. Why? Because there is something called the objection vote. We need to funnel that vote into one single platform. Or else, our foes are spin doctors. They're spin masters, right? They can invent lists and they will create objectively, let's say, neutral people. But at the end of the day, they will make us lose if we don't have that platform. And I don't know if you want me to continue here, if I took too much time.
Well, we'll get back later to what that could look like with at least traditional regime, traditional political parties that are claiming to be as October 17, as October 17. So we'll go down that road a little later. But just in terms of the time scale, do you think there's still time to at least bridge the divide? Absolutely. Okay. Definitely. Yeah. There is more. There is, because at the end of the day, we don't have a choice. So we need to, if there's no time, we need to do it, right? And I'm not going to say that we could have, that we shouldn't have done it a little bit before, but we need to do it, and there is more time. I think your SpongeBob socks are all the more reason to unify. Exactly. And you should share those among your opponents. I just saw what you're wearing. So I will zoom out from the very local experience, which is what you're describing, to the geopolitical quagmire. And Paul, thank you for letting me go back to the outer orbit of Lebanon. I'm going to ask you a broad question. I'd like to hear what you have to say with regarding to the Vienna talks, the Iran deal, the nuclear deal, whatever, the endless story of Lebanon in those negotiations, and whether or not Lebanon is even on the table. And I ask it the broad way because at times you would think Rob Mali is involved in our foreign policy, or the Americans and the Iranians are actually talking about Lebanon. And I don't know if that's true. And I assume that we are not even a bargaining chip at this stage, that we're just collateral. So is there any progress on local reforms should a deal reemerge? Or is it really irrelevant at this stage that Lebanon is not even related to that story?
Thank you, Ronnie. Number of things. Regardless of how the talks proceed or not, our basic problem will not change fundamentally. Iran has decided that it wants to have a surrogate army in Lebanon, parked next to Israel in order to deter Israel and the United States. It also has decided it wants surrogate forces in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. This is part of their, what they call like advanced defense. They consider themselves under attack, and whatever their perspective is, this is part of their strategy. Sadly, that contradicts the capacity for Lebanon to have sovereignty, obviously, to put it mildly. If there is success in the talks, it's possible afterwards that the US and Iran might then have a bit of a diplomatic track and contact, in which case they might then at that point be able to discuss other issues like Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, but not in any fundamental way, because as I said, Iran is strategically committed to this, but they might be a bit more helpful, helping form a government, do this or that. Currently, no, there is no discussion in Vienna between the US and Iran. There's hardly any discussion on the nuclear deal. There certainly is no discussion on other issues or on Lebanon. These talks are only about the nuclear issue. That's Iran is insisting on that. The US is also mainly insisting on that because they want to focus and make progress. So if there is not a deal, and that's a 50% possibility, again, it will not fundamentally change Iran's strategy. You know, with or without a deal, their strategy will remain and will continue. The question then is, if no deal is forthcoming, will the US wish to escalate or dramatically increase pressure on Iran? We don't know. That is something that's being debated in Washington now as to what to do if there is no deal. And if there is more pressure or escalation, will Iran want to respond? Would it respond in Iraq or Yemen or Lebanon or somewhere else? All of these are currently unknowns, but as I said, any talks in Vienna will not resolve our basic sovereignty question, nor should we expect salvation to come from a US-Iranian talk anywhere. A lot of the work that we have to do, and I very much agree with both Hussein and Maha, there are things we can do in Lebanon. We can't do everything. Sadly, we cannot reclaim our sovereignty. We don't want, you know, Hezbollah is heavily armed, backed by Iran. We don't have a solution for them. So we cannot really build a sovereign state, but we can certainly improve our governance, improve our representation, improve policy, which at the end of the day is still very important for Lebanese, and so that we can, you know, regain an acceptable life while we await or work for a final reclaiming of full sovereignty, which right now I can't see a horizon for that.
Thanks, Paul. Actually, I'll jump to you, Maha. With that sentiment in mind, given that the story of sovereignty and Lebanon's tools within Lebanon to reclaim lost sovereignty, I'll ask you what you think about Iran's red lines when it comes to Hezbollah. And they seem to want to negotiate endlessly on nuclear technology, or at least they have the capacity to do so. It doesn't seem like they have any interest in talking about their military matrix in the region, specifically Hezbollah. Is there any wiggle room when it comes to that relationship? Because it's, from what Paul says, and I think from what a lot of us assume, is that we don't have the local tools necessary to engage Iran, whether it's a parliamentary victory for the opposition, or even if it's through traditional diplomatic channels. So is there any wiggle space, at least in terms of getting the international attention on Lebanon's predicament, and whether or not Iran could one day let go of Lebanon in that sense, sort of cooling the temperature on Lebanon vis-a-vis Hezbollah?
Hezbollah is the red line. So as far as Iran, it's the crown jewel, if you like. as far as Iran is concerned. So the idea of Hezbollah being on the negotiating table in any conversation is a red line for Iran. Now, where it may feature is in regional negotiations with Saudi Arabia, some of which have been taking place via Iraq. And this is, I think, just to build on what Paul was saying, there's a separation today between the nuclear discussions happening in Vienna and Iran's regional activities or the more regional portfolio. That is moving far more slowly, even more slowly than the Vienna, which is really moving incredibly slowly. As you know, they've just gone back and they're supposed to meet again this week. We don't know whether they will or not. But the bottom line is, even with those regional negotiations, what we might see is, the connection between Yemen and Lebanon, where Iran may ease up in Yemen vis-a-vis the Houthis, because Yemen for Saudi Arabia is an issue of national security versus having more leeway in Lebanon in that sense. So to go back to your fundamental question, do we have any wiggle room on that front? The answer is, in terms of taking Iran or Hezbollah on, absolutely not. What we do have is the capacity to rebuild our country, to try to the extent possible work on our governance. Our challenges today go far beyond. It's not just about Hezbollah, but it's about a lot of other things as well. So I think where we have wiggle room is about everything else, unfortunately. But that is part of a regional discussion. I personally don't see any wiggle room.
But I like that you've also allowed the conversation to go into economics, and that may be the wiggle room in terms of governance and economic reform. There may be some maneuvering space there, which is why maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, the maneuvering space vis-a-vis when it comes to economic issues is one that touches on all Lebanese.
Right.
There isn't a single Lebanese today that is not touched by the economic collapse and by the triple crisis that Amer described. When he talks about the house being on fire, it's not one room in the house that's on fire. It's the entire house that's on fire. It's the foundations of the entire house that are on fire. Now, so I think we need to keep that in mind. So yes, there is room there. I think that it's when, what we saw over the past 2 years is that there has been a shift in public opinion across all communities in terms of the value or the strategic value of their respective leadership. In some communities more than others, but it has been across the board. So again, this kind of change that we're talking about is one that can only happen from within. And I think it is happening, but it's something that will take time. It's not something that will happen overnight, particularly if we don't want to go down the slippery slide of civil conflict.
Yeah.
Complete breakdown. We're there, but at least civil conflict, and where we will again all lose, as we did in the 15-year civil war.
Well, then we'll go to the slightly less tragic side, which is the house on fire with Amer. Amer, I've learned from your recommendations, and I mentioned it earlier, there were at least 2 that were published that I read. Let's say that a third is needed, even though it's 2 years post-October 17. You alluded to earlier that the foundation is broken, the house is on fire, and that measures need to be taken at this stage, immediate measures. Now, you also mentioned that the capital controls law, I think it was sent back, and it's not being signed. It was just sent back today. So if you could, within what Maha was describing, that there is the pain that we all feel, which is running parallel to the geopolitical catastrophe. What are those measures needed? And I'll interject here. It seems like, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, that there is a competent deputy prime minister who has a career at the IMF, who seems to be doing the right things, at least trying to get this IMF deal signed. His name we know, Saad al-Shami. So can we do more? And if you could sort of maybe lessen the tragedy on your terms, just in trying to find a way out given all these constraints?
Certainly. So listen, since you brought it up, I mean, when I mentioned at the very beginning about one has to give credit where credit is due, I had very much in mind people like Dr. Shami, but also other people at the cabinet who, to their credit, are technocratically very savvy, and their heart is in the right place, and they are ferociously independent, and they're moving ahead. I think the passage of the social safety net initiative, one has to give credit where credit is due to this cabinet, right? But before I answer your question, I promise I will, about what exactly the measures that I have in mind, I want to, if you don't mind, think aloud with you a little bit on the question of, is economics separate from the broader political discussion? Is economics the easier, the lower hanging fruit, right? And often in my writing, I get attacked as being naive and as being sort of the whole idea of there are technocratic answers to our problem, and all we have to do is just take them and forget about the political context. And I personally struggle with this because I think there are two ends to that argument. One side of the argument says that every economics is political by definition. Every measure, and I'll get back to those in a second, and politicize them and show why they're political in nature. They're all political. And the idea that we can take them with no political context whatsoever is extremely naive. That conclusion is obviously extremely pessimistic, because if indeed my third leg of the problem continues, which is this political paralysis, then we cannot do anything in economics, right? So there's one side of the argument that says, you know what, ignore economics, it's all about politics. Once we deal with the foundational issues of sovereignty, of the role of the state, of sectarian politics, which I'm always amazed we don't talk enough about the Taifi, right? Until we deal with these things, that's like, so there's no need to deal with economics at all. This is complete failure, complete moot. There's no way you can move. There's the other argument that says, no, you start by stabilizing the situation. You get some low-hanging fruit, you get some basic wins, and you build on those wins, you build on that gradual improvements to start an avalanche, to start a virtuous cycle of political transformation where people see the advantages of success, the advantage of prosperity, and that becomes the tool, the lever through which political transformation eventually takes place. And in many ways, listening to Hussein, I think that's what he has in mind, is that at this point we need to be more gradual, we need to accept what we have. And I am very much of that view, is that we need to do something. So what do we need to do, right? I think what we need to do at this stage is the first priority is stop the rot, stop the fire. And stopping the fire means a few very straightforward things. None of them are easy. All of them are politically extremely complicated, but let's be clear, they need to be done, right? We need to tighten monetary policy. The liquidity expansion right now, which at the end of the day is at the core of the reason why the exchange rate keeps on imploding, has to be stopped, right? The idea, so the liquidity management is something crucial. Otherwise, there's no way we can stop the currency from the implosion that is occurring right now. We need to rebalance the supply and the demand of dollars in the system, right? Part of that means attracting new dollars into the system. We need to, but part of it is stopping outflows, right? So capital control becomes an important way to stop the flood, because you need to rebalance. And that means also, again, very, very political in nature, doing some prioritization, some strategic prioritization. We have a finite amount of dollars with an unlimited amount of demand for dollars. So we need to be very strategic about how we rebalance that supply and that demand, and that requires prioritization. Where do we want those dollars to be spent, right? Not every. So that also is an immediate measure as part of the stabilization. Public sector financing is an unbelievably important topic that nobody's talking about. The government has completely disappeared. The government doesn't exist anymore. Public spending, Ronnie, has dropped from $9 billion before the crisis to $2 billion. I've never in my career seen government spending collapse that much. There's no government institutions in power, right? So we need to resuscitate the public sector. The public sector has a huge role. That, though, means, unfortunately, revenues. We have to accept, right? To spend more, we need to collect more. Revenues have also collapsed. Tax revenues have collapsed from 9 billion, equal amounts, from 9 to 2 billion. We need to figure out, and that's politically extremely difficult, right? and we can go through what those measures are, but we need new measures to raise revenue if we want to resuscitate the state as well. We do all of this, and as a result of this program, which, by the way, sort of another leg of that program is social safety net. Extremely important that we protect the poor from the massive amount of pain that's going to come as a result of increasing revenues, increasing taxation, but also the new higher prices. So we need a social safety net program. So once we do all of this, and to my mind, this is what we need to focus on at this stage. Those measures I mentioned, those 5 measures I mentioned, is we should stop. This is what we need to do. We need to stop the fire by doing these things. Once we do them, then, presumably after the elections, we have a huge new agenda dealing with the foundations, right? The public sector debt, the banking sector restructuring, the reinventing and reimagining the states, the state as well. The private sector regulatory framework that is needed. A huge agenda. But you know what? For the time being, let's do the first things just to stop the fire. Sorry, I went too long.
No. On the contrary, there's a follow-up I'd like to ask, but Maha, you wanted to interject.
I just wanted to add one thing.
Yes.
I mean, when we talk about social protection, it's not just about safety nets. Safety nets are important. The 2 programs we're looking at right now that are being launched by the World Bank with the government of Lebanon are important because they're providing some cash transfers, minimal cash transfers, but this is not enough. What is needed is really to guarantee the right to education and the right to health for every single Lebanese. You're talking about a country where more than 60% of the population is now considered poor, and where 70 to 80% suffer from some sort of multidimensional poverty. These are UN data. Multidimensional poverty means they're impoverished either in terms of health, education, housing, and a whole host of other issues. So I think we're no longer talking about a small segment of the population that we need to provide some relief to. It's actually almost all of Lebanon. And this is something we really need to keep in mind as we move forward, probably in the post-election period, as we think about how are we going to reimagine this new Lebanon. Lebanon has gone through whiplash. I mean, just as an analogy, October 2019, we were considered a middle-income country. Today, we're not even a low-income country. So the whiplash is huge. The shock to the system is huge, and it's a shock that's changing the very identity of this country.
No, I appreciate that. And actually, Amer, I'll sort of elaborate further on what Maha said. Is this simply beyond the current cabinet's capacity? That we're just going to have to wait and see what elections bring about next year? Trying to link the 2 issues together, politics and the economic disaster. Do you see it as
completely.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I think that's sort of the essence of what I'm saying is that I think the political breathing space that the current government, technocratically sound as it is, with all the respect that I have for them, is just limited, right? The context, the political context that they're having right now is almost impossible to imagine the big dossiers that we need to be dealing with. The best that they can do, and even that is extremely ambitious, is deal with the stabilization, deal with monetary management, exchange rate management, capital controls, raising revenues, basic increases in taxation, in spending, basic increases in social safety nets, not the big ones that Maha is talking about, much more basic ones. That's all we can, and then maybe another conference to try to raise some capital from some funding from the rest of the world. I think that's the maximum they can do. The agenda, the true agenda, and here, if you don't mind, I'm going to spend 30 seconds on what Maha is saying, because I think it's incredibly important. The true agenda is the one that comes afterwards, right? Which is debt sustainability, banking sector restructuring, and by far most importantly, reimagining the role of the state. The Lebanese state has historically, even before the crisis, been extremely imbalanced, right? It was, you're going to be shocked here by what I'm going to say, because the stereotype, the narrative is that the Lebanese state is too big and too wasteful. And that's very true. It's extremely wasteful, extremely inefficient, extremely corrupt, but it was not a big state. The state never in Lebanon had spent enough money on things that need to be spent money on, right? Things like education, health, infrastructure, social safety of the kinds that Maha is talking about, right? Security, right? But the true kind of security, rebuilding the army in a way, not just to give them pensions, but to rebuild the army so that we can legitimately say they have a monopoly over armaments. These are regulating the private sector, right? Antitrust. The private sector monopoly in Lebanon is notorious. The private sector needs privatization in Lebanon, right? These are a huge agenda of redefining the state. This is certainly not the political moment to do that, but at least let's know what we're hoping for down the road.
I appreciate that, Amer. And actually, the reimagination of the state is, I think, exactly what Minteshreen stands for, Hussein. And I've seen your website, not your website, Minteshreen's website. There's detailed policy statements. There's a lot of engagement on economics, whether it's the health sector or education or anything really that's impacting all of us. I think Minteshreen has ideas. I'm going to ask you two questions, and I think somehow they link up. The first one is, assuming there are some gains made in the elections next year, how do you see Minteshreen's role in trying to get that agenda forward? And another question, my engagement with your supporters tends to be primarily on social media, and they tend to be a very young, active body, not just in Lebanon, but abroad. Are you able to message to the older generation as well? Do you find that there's an older audience listening to what Minteshreen says? Or do you think they're still more inclined to go to the older parties? Because I think that offers a way to talk about also trying to engage regime parties in October 17 in general. So this may be the hardest question so far, but are you, the agency you have as a young party in parliament and reaching out to all Lebanese?
So I'm going to tell you that we've had that discussion, by the way, internally in Minteshreen about trying to reach out, older population demographics. We've had very big success with the younger generation, especially because we use alternative media in order to reach our, our supporters. And traditional media, this is a major problem that not just Minteshreen has, Ronnie, but most of the nascent political parties, because access to airtime costs money. And these are newly founded organizations, that don't have that much resources or access to these, traditional, let's say, media outlets. Now, what we're trying to do is to actually sometimes to twerk the narrative in a much more accepted wording in order for it to reach more, and use, for example, social media platforms such as WhatsApp, for example, or Facebook. Sometimes.
The older generation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but WhatsApp, or it works much better. Mm-hmm. Now, if I want to just go back a little with your first question, and I think both Maha and Amer talked about the new Lebanon and the necessity to really think about this new Lebanon post-elections. And you asked the question whether Minteshreen, how do we see our role in implementing reform? Mm-hmm. See, this is a major issue of Lebanon. I think Amer talked about political reform. We call it in Minteshreen the culture of sabotage in Lebanon. So we believe that it's true. This is, some people call it a democracy based on sectarian, let's say, sharing system. Others call it a kleptocracy, but it's also a vetocracy. See, we have evolved, especially after the Doha agreement, to reach a certain place where these sectarian power holders can sabotage institutions for not just crises, big crises, but for even appointments of public servants within the administration. I mean, it could be something as trivial as that. And the sabotage goes from the legislative branch. I mean, small examples, Article 34 of the internal regulations of our parliament, and the secrecy, which is it's not even the exception, it's the principle in committees. You can't even know what the deliberation are, how they talk, how they take their decisions. In the executive branch, you have executive decrees. Imagine in 2020, end of 2020, we had 50 executive decrees waiting to be issued for legislations that is crucial. We're talking about telecoms, electricity, anti-corruption, civil aviation safety. I mean, why? If you dig down, if you dig deep, they tell you it's technical and it's political. It's not. It's just because they want to sabotage reform in order to maintain their tools of power and in order to broker more deals. And so the justice system, I'm not going to go there, you know it. The administration, you know it. But even the security apparatus, right? Even our armed forces. When you see in 2011, for example, I don't know if you remember, when our Minister of Interior gave an explicit and direct order to the head of the ISF to, you know, dismantle his troops around the premises, and he refused. Up cold, he refused, and the minister resigned. When you grow up seeing this, you see that there is no rule of law, and there is no accountability in this country. And going forward demands that we address these issues. It's very important we do.
Well, I'm going to get on a trampoline now and bounce back to the international realm. And Paul, I want to ask you a follow-up question to at least Lebanon's non-existent role in the Vienna talks. I think it's fair to suggest, at least now, that there's an accepted indirect role of Syria and Lebanon. And I'll say this in the broadest way possible. Whether it's the Americans trying to get energy into Lebanon vis-a-vis Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, or whether it's general rapprochement in the region with the Assad regime, or if it's not rapprochement, at least there's engagement. And I think it's likely that Lebanon will be at least, there will be fallout to Assad's re-emerging rule. And if you can maybe add to that, if you see it this way, if you see it as simply that it's just it's a non-issue, that this is a Russian-backed regime and Assad has no role in Lebanon, or if the Russians, with supporting Assad, see a stabilizing role in this country. And I'm asking it this way to see whether or not, long-term, we're going back to the early 1990s, where the Syrian regime is sort of the balancing factor, whether it's Hezbollah or Iran in Lebanon or other issues, that the regime is looked at as a crisis management, more than conflict resolution story for this country. So are we going back in time?
We're going back in time, but not in that sense. We've gone back many decades in terms of our economic and social decline. The Assad regime is a crippled, extremely weak, will continue to be crippled and extremely weak for many years, maybe decades. It has no real route to proper economic revival. There's no real pathway to that. The relations between the state and its people are broken, and they're becoming increasingly broken as the regime runs more desperately out of cash and out of resources. They're now deeply in the drug production and smuggling. They have taken predatory steps to take over whatever private sector existed in Syria in order to get cash to their regime. Yes, there is a, what's the word, rapprochement, whatever, from a number of Arab countries to the Assad regime. They've all recognized that, he's here to stay, he's not going anywhere. And many of them feel better to have relations with that regime in order to try to reduce Iran's sort of monopolistic, or Iran and Russia's monopolistic control, so that the Arab countries have a little bit of leverage in Syria. Countries like Jordan are desperately worried about the drug production and smuggling that's coming into Jordan. Of course, it's backed by the regime, but they recognize they have to talk to the regime if they need to reduce it. Yes, I think the Assad regime is likely to have a little bit more influence in Lebanon in the coming months and maybe years, but it will remain, I would say, very marginal. Hezbollah, obviously, and Iran is very strong in Syria and will remain the dominant player in Lebanon. No, in terms of a non-state actor, no, we're not returning to the days when Syria in the 90s was a very stable, strong, powerful, well-connected. It had the power to do that. This is not the case. What's relevant, I think, for Lebanon in its international relations, obviously we've already talked about it, but I want to emphasize the good fortune that really Lebanon has a ready and waiting international community led by Europe and the United States, with support from Russia and China, and the international community more broadly, support and extending of hand that says, if you, meaning the Lebanese government, with all the details that Amer was talking about, if you take the proper steps in the country to begin to reform, to begin to stem, to try to put out the fire, begin thinking about really restructuring, we, the international community, are here. We are favorable. We will put forces. We're serious. We want to help Lebanon. We don't want Lebanon to collapse. We are lucky as Lebanon to have that level of interest and level of willingness. That interest and willingness remains, but it's up to us, it's up to the Lebanese government in this particular case, or a post-election government, to do the ABCs of the homework that we need to do, and we will find a willing international community, willing and eager to help Lebanon. I would hope that the Arab countries, if we undertake those reforms, if the IMF, the international community, sees there's enough progress to give confidence in Lebanon, that maybe we can get some of the Gulf countries along as well. I just want to say we're lucky to have that level of interest. So we are not completely on our own, but we have a lot of homework to do, and it's not easy, as Amer has outlined.
Thanks, Paul. Maha, I'll ask you about the willingness, at least, for certain countries to get involved in trying to alleviate local suffering. I'll just offer an analogy. 16 months ago, Emmanuel Macron is walking down Jebmezi, and Lebanese are embracing him. He's surrounded by rubble, and there's promises that Lebanon will not be abandoned. Within maybe days, or if not hours, there's engagement with Hezbollah, later with Iran, and the French eventually, I think, to a degree, say we can't do anything about this. You fast forward 16 months. Was it last week? Macron is in Riyadh, trying to get the Saudis to talk to us again. It's almost like Macron went full circle with us. And there seems to be genuine interest in trying to help Lebanese fix this country, and yet there's a lot of, I don't want to say failure, but it doesn't seem like things move in the right direction, even when it comes to French policy in this country, let alone how long it took to form a government and all the other things that happened in the last 16 months. If the willingness is there, do you see any positive trends when it comes to at least France's role in this country? Whether it's working with the Americans, whether it's trying to get the GCC to take it easy on this country, can we expect any hope in that sense?
Look, for others to help us, Ronnie, we have to help ourselves. Now, when it comes to the French role, I think they tried to play a positive role. To my mind, perhaps, I mean, the engagement wasn't just with Hezbollah, it was the entire political class. If you remember the famous picture at the Palais des Pins, the French residence with the traditional political leadership. And that became a very hot potato for the French administration. And this was right after the explosion. Mm-hmm. So they engaged with everyone. To my mind, the French initiative very quickly lost its steam in the reformist agenda it was trying to put forward, and they lowered the bar. It got to a point where we just want a government, any government, but just to get some progress. In a sense, I understand some of the impetus for this because the country is collapsing. I mean, we stayed 18 months or 13 months without a government in the aftermath of the third most powerful non-nuclear explosion in the world. And we haven't talked about the explosion yet.
I say
the accountability, the issue of accountability, we still don't know what happened. We don't have a clear narrative. We don't know that there will be accountability, that there will be justice for an explosion, for the victims of an explosion that literally took out half the city. So to go back to your question, yes, the French and others, the Americans and others, the EU, everybody's saying we're willing to help, but you've got to help yourselves. And until now, and this is where I agree very much with Amer, I don't see the political will. Until now, what has actually completely shocked me is the extent to which the political leadership seems to be almost indifferent to the suffering of the Lebanese broadly, the extent to which they're in the calculus. I don't see the connection between Lebanon's survival and their own survival. I don't see them seeing that, making that connection. That somehow, even if the country, the country has been in free fall for quite some time now, and yet we see decisions being taken or not being taken. The new government was completely blocked within weeks of being formed. It's now 2 months they haven't been able to meet. And partly it's the port explosion, trying to sideline, we know the story there. So even frankly, the crisis with Qurdahi, for me, what I found astonishing about the way the crisis was dealt with is that it was almost like it was an internal matter, not an international issue where they needed to deal with Saudi Arabia and with the Gulf and to try and address it there. The trade-offs that we saw being discussed before Macron took it upon himself to take the resignation with him, the trade-offs were internal. We were hearing about trade-offs between Qurdahi's resignation, the port explosion, the Tayouni investigation. So it's again, the political bottlenecks and the petty politics, frankly, the small calculations of the leadership is, to my mind, just astonishing in that sense. And so long as that persists, it doesn't matter how willing the international community is to help us. The EU, we didn't talk about the EU. The EU is extremely willing and want to support. A lot of, I've heard this repeatedly from international interlocutors, but they need something to work with and someone to work with. And until now, they don't feel that they don't see the willingness on the part of the Lebanese political establishment.
I'll ask you one thing about the EU. The threat of sanctions that came and went, at least in terms of concerted sanctions that were supposed to take effect, and I don't know if that is still happening or not. Is there any discussion there?
They have put together a framework for sanctions, which they got 22 countries to agree on. No small feat within the EU. The EU is notorious for things taking an incredibly long time. My understanding is they do have a list of individuals that they're looking into. They are willing to get sanctions on, or put sanctions on anyone they see as obstructing the political and socioeconomic recovery of the country. Until now, they haven't moved on anything. I don't see them moving on anything very soon.
So not to get into speculation, but is it France's role that in a way pushes these things through?
Oh, the EU it's not just France. The EU, France is one of the most powerful countries in the EU, and it has its weight. But again, this has to be an agreement between 22 countries. So
it's too conspiratorial to suggest that the French are perhaps one of the reasons why we don't see that happening. Because I'm wondering if they are still interested in trying to keep a semblance of governance, which you alluded to earlier, if that's the priority.
I think they're using the carrot and the stick approach. Yes, they want to win, and yes, they want a semblance of governance. At the end of the day, the international community needs a government that has its full powers to be able to engage with it and to try and get some of the reforms forward, including the negotiations with the IMF. Once the former government had resigned, these negotiations could no longer move forward. So we needed a functioning government in place. We would have liked to have perhaps a different set of government given the emergency situation we're in, but this is where we are. And I think the current government, I agree with Amer, there are some really good people there, and they're really trying to, get some deal in place. But like him, that a proper, and there's a lot to be said about the capital control law that was presented to Parliament, and it's good that it didn't pass. But if they can't get a decent capital control law through, I'm not sure what they're going to get through. The adjustment, just one last sentence on this, the adjustment that we've seen in Lebanon has been one of the most unfair historically anywhere, and Amer can confirm this given his experience. Until now, it's ordinary Lebanese who've bore the brunt of the crisis, and it's not the economic, it's not the political elite. It's really the ordinary people who have seen their savings, have seen their pensions, and have seen their income completely disappear. And I think it's something we need to keep in mind.
I'll just add something over Maha.
Yes.
Over what Maha said about the capital control law. Actually, the most baffling part was other new special tribunals, because again, this is what we needed, right? So you know very well that usually they compartmentalize justice, okay? We have special tribunals everywhere in Lebanon, from the High Council of Ministers and to prosecute ministers and presidents, to this new capital control law. So they wanted to deprive the citizen from its ability to actually go and have a legal recourse against whatever the BDL decides to do with his money, So this is major as well, or her. I said it, but so this is major. And part of why this law was stopped is because something has changed already. You know, they monitor, and they're really scared from the public uproar that is usually emanating from the civil society and from, you know, new nascent groups like Minteshreen. And once that boulonnage started accumulating, when it was one call to action, then 10 call to actions in 24 hours, I think they didn't want to go there, because we were intending on all going to UNESCO. And going to UNESCO, we had only went once for the victims of the Beirut Port explosion. This is on the night when they were, you know, they were hit in the streets.
I'm going to try to wrap it up with the picture behind us, which is the one issue that we haven't discussed. This is, I think, the pressing issue. And I think today, if not just hours ago, Tarek Bitar was given permission to resume his probe. So this is just today. We've seen that probe suspended. We've seen it threatened. We've seen violence in Tayune as a side effect of that story. I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. We've seen everything that could go wrong to a local investigation. Judge Bitar is the second judge. So, given that we're 16 months after the port blast, and given that it seems like, even if Judge Bitar stays, the potential to find resolution to this blast decreases over time. Without dismissing it altogether, but it's hard to imagine Tarek Bitar being able to sort of steam ahead and anticipate resolution to such a huge, terrible, one of the biggest tragedies that this country's ever witnessed, if not the biggest one, in terms of destroying Beirut, civilian casualties, infrastructure. What can we expect? From Judge Bitar still paralyzed and threats of the investigation moving to a military court rather than staying where it is. From both sides, because I understand that there's no international push for an international investigation at this stage, and you have protesters that show up on every occasion trying to get answers. You have families that are harassed, families that sometimes use doublespeak when they're threatened. So anything you can add to where this is in terms of reform? Well, maybe I can start with you, Maha, and then we can,
Okay. On the issue of the investigation, I think we should not lose hope. By the way, there is an international push on the investigation and the importance of the investigation. There is a push by some family members who have, who are either non-Lebanese or have dual passports, to get an international investigation or a joint national/international investigation going, but that hasn't happened. But there's a lot of pressure. I think the legal system in Lebanon has some really good judges. We still have pockets of integrity that we should not lose sight of. Just on the issue of justice and accountability, again, going back to reimagining Lebanon, it's impossible to think of a new Lebanon if it's not built on the foundation of justice and accountability. We saw what an amnesty at the end of the Civil War did to us. Much of what we're dealing with today is because there was no accountability at the end of the Civil War. Actually, even worse, many of those who were accountable found themselves in positions of power. So I think it's important to say that the port explosion is not just, it's not one more thing. It is the thing for many of us, particularly for the future of this country.
Amer, could you offer any insight into the economic angle towards impunity? Because I assume that is one of the biggest, most tangible consequences to having no justice. And we're talking about the port blast and the impact it has on politics, on society. But how do you see the economic disaster tying into impunity and not being able to address justice 31 years and the need to do so?
No, it's an incredibly important question. And I personally spend a lot of time thinking about this. And I'm very influenced by a model I understand, that I know quite well, which is the South African model, the truth and reconciliation. And one of the things that often that the truth part that eventually led to the reconciliation wasn't just about the politics, wasn't just about apartheid. It was also about economic genocide, right? It was about how that society for 100 years before liberation massively oppressed economically sort of the black community in South Africa. And much of the transition that we saw afterwards, and I mean, South Africa still faces significant challenges since then, but at least the path forward is well defined. And I and many others academically have argued that one of the reasons why they've been able to put themselves on a track of progress is because they resolved the problems of the past. They studied them, they talked about them, they analyzed them, even when there was a pardon, and there was a pardon incidentally, that pardon came only after memory was sort of unshackled. They remembered, they talked, they thought. And from my angle, sort of the economics angle, the economic crisis that we're going through right now is just as traumatic as any other political shock that the country has faced, including the Civil War, the 4th of August, the economic tragedy that we're facing right now, the massive loss of wealth, the huge forced immigration by our young and our skilled is a crime just as big as the political crime. And we owe it to ourselves to study it, analyze it, figure out what went wrong and who did wrong, right? Whether we want to eventually bring that to fruition through punitive action or not is something we as a society can discuss. But the idea that we can close our eyes to this massive crime and move as if nothing has happened, just like we did after the Civil War, is something that's completely unacceptable. The one thing I would keep in mind, though, and this is, I'm going to sort of contradict myself a little bit, but I think it's an important nuance, is we also don't want that call for truth to distract us, to become a distracting force in the way that, unfortunately, it is being used right now. So the تدقيق الجنائي, to use the term that is being expressed in Arabic right now, is unfortunately becoming an excuse not to do anything else. So while I am completely for having a forensic analysis, and I don't think we can move forward until we actually understand what happened and who did it, it's important that in parallel, that does not stop us from the short-term things that we need to do, the tactic, that we need to do. I think we need to do both. We need truth, but we also need stabilization.
I really appreciate the wider perspective. I appreciate the long view as well, Amer. I think I share that sentiment fully. And I think it would be maybe perhaps naive to suggest that there's dramatic change, at least positive change on the horizon. But as you said, Hussein, at the beginning, this is the first step. Yeah. And I think your role in Minteshreen and Minteshreen itself represents something refreshing and new, turning the page. And I wish you the best next year.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Maha, thank you for offering both the local, regional, and at times the international perspective on what's happening to this country and emphasizing the need for accountability and justice, something that we dismissed after the Civil War ended. And Amer, thank you for logging into Zoom from New York. Thanks, Paul. And thank you to the maychidiacfoundation and to the U.S. Embassy, the Public Affairs section, in helping fund this program. And I guess the debate goes on, the discussions carry on, and I'll see all of you on the podcast again next year.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you
Take care.
much.